We want to now turn our attention to the topic of the week. That is tomorrow's anniversary, 1 year anniversary of the start of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And to start us off on that note, we are honored, as we always are, to be joined here by Mr. Vijay Prashad, who is the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute. Dr. Prashad, thank you so much for being with us. Oh, you're muted.
Muted. We just can't. I mean,
you're 100% muted, but I feel like you had to have said something good.
No. It's nice to be with you. It's nice to be with you.
I don't believe that's what he was saying. Do you?
I'm getting older.
Do you buy that? Do you buy that's what he was saying?
Well, we're all getting older. That's the good thing. We're all in it together. But this global conflict, another thing we're all not by our own will in together here. We're 1 year on. I guess maybe rather than editorialize, Vijay, I'm just curious, what are some of your reflections going into tomorrow's 1 year anniversary?
Well, it's an interesting anniversary because the anniversary itself is filled with debate about what's going on. You know, it's not like something quite straightforward, something that was a destruction, an earthquake in Syria and in Turkey and so on. Here, how one even talks about what happened last year in February and when that conflict begins and who are the players in that conflict, all of that is up for grabs. Is this a Russian invasion of Ukraine? Is this a contest between NATO and Russia? Where is China in this? Is this a war? You know, as we speak, the G20 countries are gathering in Bangalore in southern India. And that's one of the issues that they've already dealt with on the first day of the G20 meeting. United States trying to say it's a war. This is for the final communique. You know, on day one, they start to draft the communique. United States saying it's a war. India, which is, the chair of the G20 right now, is pushing back and saying, no, we don't want to use the word war. We're going to call it a crisis. You know, the crisis in Ukraine, the crisis or the challenge. These are the two words they are using, crisis and challenge. In fact, Eugene, you started off by saying conflict in Ukraine. Conflict is somewhere in between war and crisis. Crisis is an extremely generic way of talking about what has happened this year in Ukraine. So it's very hard to even understand how to talk about the 1 year anniversary, because how you talk about what's happening is already got inside it your opinion about what's going on in this war. And there's so much quote unquote information war happening that words seem to matter in this conflict, war, much more than in any other conflict, crisis, war that I've ever followed before in my life.
There's so many different aspects of this war. There's the way that it's revealed how, Europe really doesn't have any sort of independent policies of its own. It's really a subject of the Americans on so many levels. It's also demonstrated that, the U.S. is looking at this as a sort of kind of practice round against China, right? We've heard a lot of U.S. officials talking about how Ukraine they want to use the Ukraine playbook with Taiwan. And then there's also the stakes. That's what I want to ask you about. I want to ask you about the stakes because the stakes of the war seem to keep growing. The escalation, there's almost no means of diplomacy anymore. You have almost no arms treaties left between the U.S. and Russia at this point. You have this explosive story out from Seymour Hersh a couple weeks ago about how the U.S. covertly blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, attacked the infrastructure of its ally Germany, and what can only be considered an act of terrorism. I mean, the sort of going up the escalation ladder hasn't stopped since last year, and it seems like, on all sides, particularly on the NATO side, that there's even more resolve to continue to sacrifice Ukrainians at the altar of weakening Russia. And of course, that leaves us with the whole threat of potential nuclear warfare. So I'm curious if you could talk a bit about the seriousness of the stakes of this war, because I don't feel as though that gets talked about enough, particularly in the mainstream.
Well, it is deeply chilling. I mean, look, I was very interested that the Chinese foreign minister went to Munich at the security conference, and he said, now Ukraine, tomorrow Taiwan. He said, "Is this the road you're taking?" And he and Wang Yi, who's the highest Chinese diplomatic official, were asking questions in Munich, which I found quite interesting. What were they asking? They were asking the United States elites, effectively, perhaps the European elites, how far are you willing to go? Are you going to go all the way on this? Are you going to launch nuclear weapons and so on? What's the game plan here? What's up with you guys? And actually, I would say that that's a really good discussion for people to have. What is the US elite up to here? What do they want? Do they want the dismemberment of Russia, the collapse of the current governing structure? Let me tell you something. My generation, in the 1990s, my generation in Russia, people who are now in their 50s and 60s, experienced a regime change already. They saw the catastrophic decline in the living standards and so on. People in my generation who are now in positions of some authority in Russia, they simply don't want to see a repeat of that twice in the lifetimes of people. They just don't want to see that again. Whatever their opinion of Mr. Putin, whatever their opinion of the conflict in Ukraine, they're simply not interested in revisiting the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the same way as during the Arab Spring, people used to ask, why aren't the Algerians rising up? Well, because the Algerians fought a decade-long catastrophic civil war. And I remember being in Algiers, being in Oran, asking people, why isn't there, the kind of copycat phenomena of the Arab Spring? And they said, we are exhausted by this stuff. People tried to come after the what is known in Algeria as the power, and then said, look, it's just not going to happen like this. We're not going to go out on the street and see our young killed again. This sense of civilizational exhaustion is not being taken seriously. In the same way, in China, there's a high level of support of the government for all kinds of reasons, perhaps positive reasons. But one of them is that people have looked carefully at what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed, and they don't want to repeat that in China. So the question to ask of the US elites, what's your game plan? Do you really think you're going to be able to dismember Russia? There's no appetite in Russia for it. You're going to have to impose this with force. What kind of force will you use? Are you going to go nuclear, as it were? And now, Mr. Putin has withdrawn Russia from the New START treaty. That was to have expired in 2026. There's some chatter about how, well, Russia is withdrawing from treaties. Let me remind people, and I think, Rania, you already indicated that United States unilaterally withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002. That was George W. Bush. United States unilaterally withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, the INF Treaty 2019. That was Donald Trump. That wasn't Putin. Putin has merely come in on a third run and said, well, you guys are not interested in discussing a architecture for nuclear, as it were, management. We're out of here. We're gone. New START is finished. I was chilled by the departure from New START because now there are no hotlines anymore. There's no red phone between the two important countries, And I think that's the reason why the Chinese came to Munich, why Wang Yi went to Russia, why they're trying to tell Blinken and Biden and others, listen, guys, you got to grow up here. There are serious matters at stake. And the Chinese have launched a global security initiative this week around those issues. It's not just China. It's India, it's Indonesia, it's Mexico, it's South Africa, range of developing countries extraordinarily worried about all this. I was very interested at Munich to listen to the Prime Minister of Namibia. Her name is Sarah Kungonelwa Amadila. And she said something interesting. She first cautioned that this war was going out of hand. And then she said, this is the Prime Minister of Namibia, the bottom line is that money used to buy weapons would be better used to promote development in Ukraine, in Africa, in Asia, in the European Union itself, where many people are facing hardships. That's the attitude of the majority of people in the world. It's well worth your listeners knowing that you add up the total population of North America, Canada, and United States, leave out Mexico, Canada, the United States, and Europe, you'll struggle to reach a billion people. There are 7 billion people on the planet. 1 billion people don't constitute the international community. And in that 1 billion people, there's a lot of disagreement with what their governments are doing. So they don't even speak for a billion people in a planet of 7 billion. And that's why they're having a great deal of difficulty in the G20. And that's the reason why Emmanuel Macron in Munich said that the West has lost credibility in the global South. Very strong statement from Emmanuel Macron.
I think you raise a good point, and it's one of these questions I think is very much hanging over geopolitics. Is all of these different sort of Western architectures, the G20. I took Yellen's pushing at the finance ministers meeting around Ukraine to be sort of bullying of India. We saw last year Indonesia was the president of the G20, same thing, constant bullying them to take a particular position, to ban Russia, to invite Zelensky, so on and so forth. Next two presidents of the G20 are Brazil and South Africa, maybe in the reverse order. But I just maybe am wondering your thoughts about some of these changes we're seeing go through them, because obviously the G20 was not set up to be a forum for the global South to have a platform, but to include a handful more countries into the Western club.
Well, look, the G20 was created, Eugene, just to remind us to provide liquidity in the Western financial institutions, because in 2007, China and India were running surpluses, and the Western countries went begging to Indonesia, India, China, and other countries and said, put some of your money into our banking system because our banking system is insolvent. And in fact, Sarkozy said, we're going to shut down the G7 and the G20 will be the new executive of the world. Well, they created the G20, they maintained the G7. Now, Janet Yellen came in and started pushing people around and saying, hello, listen, got to increase sanctions on Russia. I was very interested in the response from several of the countries. The first interesting response was they basically went to rule. They said, look, this is not the Security Council, Ms. Yellen. This is a body to deal with economic issues. We deal with trade issues, with financial management of the world order. So they basically came to rule. They said, no, wait, you're in the wrong forum. You want to talk about sanctions? Go to the UN Security Council. This is not where we talk about sanctions. This is where we talk about economic growth, where we talk about the fact that the total global debt overhang is $65 trillion. I mean, this is where we deal with that. This is where we deal with declining growth rates. I thought that was a very interesting and studious response to Janet Yellen. It also shows the desperation of the United States, which is using every and any forum to try to browbeat countries of the global South. For instance, the US-Africa summit held in December in Washington, D.C. was a way to get African countries to basically come on side. And guess what? Here's the Namibian Prime Minister in Munich saying, sorry, pals, I'm not with you. The attempt to get countries around the world to send arms to Ukraine, the full court press trying to get Brazil to send arms to Ukraine, and the Brazilians saying, listen, this is not what we buy arms for. It's not to transship them to Ukraine. And by the way, the reason I slipped and said Israel is because the United States had Israel send a lot of the warehoused equipment to Ukraine, the kind of stuff that was rotting in an Israeli warehouse, in order for the West to say, look, we're arming the Ukrainians. I mean, there's got to be a little bit of you got to understand that they're also putting out their used surplus on the Ukrainians and, jetting up their own engines to get new supplies for themselves. This is not all humanitarian. The US is ordering a lot of stuff for itself. Anyway, the point is that the US is desperate, going to every single forum, trying to get people to, arm twist countries to condemn Russia, to bring Ukraine into the fold and so on. These countries are just not going to do it. I mean, look in India, for instance, the big top elites, the Ambanis, the Adanis, and so on, they are buying coal from Russia. They are buying energy. The Indian public sector energy company, ONGC, Oil and Natural Gas Corporation, is buying assets that the Europeans and the Americans are vacating in Russia. The business opportunities with the Russians are also attractive. It's not just this. And also, something that I want to put on the table here is there is a growing, and I don't know what kind of adjective to use for this, but there's a growing sentiment among the middle class in countries like India, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, and so on, which is quote unquote anti colonial. It's a terrible, it's not really anti colonial, it's not radical, but they just now are at the point in world history where some middle class person in India is saying, I don't want to be pushed around by Janet Yellen. We have our own destiny, we have our own national interests, and so on. And in a way, the Yanks are having a hard time coming to terms with the fact that this middle class, which had been groveling in the early decades of globalization, is now finally standing up and saying, hey, listen, if we want to eat something, we're going to eat it. We want to smoke in our houses, we're going to do that. There's a kind of middle class arrival in these countries, which I think is a surprise to the United States.
Indeed. Well, I also am curious, what do you think that signifies in the sense of U.S. waning power? Because you do have all of these countries, and we're not talking about here like just Venezuela and Cuba and, Syria and the countries, Iran, that obviously the U.S. is already at some kind of level of warfare with, and our adversary countries that automatically are willing to stand up to the U.S. We're talking about countries like you mentioned, India and India's middle class. I mean, India is refusing to join in on U.S. sanctions, right? You have countries across Africa, a humongous continent, refusing to join in on U.S. sanctions. Also, Latin America not only refuses to join in on U.S. sanctions, but countries in Latin America are refusing, like you mentioned, Brazil, refusing to send weapons. What does that say about U.S. power around the world? And I'm sorry to say that with a smile on my face. I'm a little overly optimistic, but
I think it's perfectly acceptable to smile with that, but at the same time, I think we need to be sober about what's happening, because while this is happening in Bangalore, where the Indian government is saying, look, we're not interested in hard language against Russia in this document, India is sniffing around, wondering if it should join or become part of what's known as NATO plus. This is on the table. It's very much there. On the African continent, yes, you got countries saying, look, we think focus on Ukraine is unfortunate. We have our own problems and so on. At the same time, the government of Ghana welcomes the United States and gives them access to a terminal in the airport. And in fact, US military presence on the African continent is increasing. There's a liaison office of the US Defense Department inside the African Union building in Addis Ababa. So these things are very complicated, and it's not linear. At the same time as you've got this middle class saying, hey, listen, I'm fed up with being told what to do, they're also saying, oh, well, it's a US military coming in. Maybe we'll gain something. There'll be some contracts and whatever. I mean, don't forget that when the Chinese come into countries, they make contracts with local providers to build roads or build a hospital or whatever it is. The US also shows up. They don't contract to build hospitals. They contract to build runways, to build a base, to go and work on their base and so on. They're also producing investment. It's merely military investment. But don't underestimate the power of that. I mean, the French are being booted out of the Sahel region, out of Burkina Faso, out of Mali, and so on. But the US base in Niger, in Agadez, Niger, is still as big as it was, the largest drone base in the world. We are in the period of contradiction. This is the interregnum between two periods. We just don't know how long this interregnum is going to last. But I think we have got to watch very carefully what's going on. Is the Indian government sincerely opposed to the US footprint on the world? Or is it merely opposed to what the United States is doing with Russia? In other words, if tomorrow the US ramps up the pressure on China, will India, and this government in particular, which has problems with China in general, will India then say, no, we also want to join even deeper the squeeze on China? I don't think this is necessarily some kind of principled break with either globalization or with US imperialism. I think we're in a period where we're seeing a lot of pragmatic and practical decisions being made by these countries like Indonesia, India, also Mexico. I mean, I don't know if Mexico's rebellion against US foreign policy led by Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, I don't know if this rebellion by AMLO is in fact going to be deeper than his period in office. What happens when the next Mexican president comes? Will that president maintain Mexico's rebellion against US foreign policy in Latin America? Right now, Mexico, in fact, is leading the rebellion against US foreign policy in Latin America. Mexico is the leading country saying we're going to, lead a global rebellion against the blockade of Cuba. Will this remain beyond AMLO? I think we've got to understand this is a period of practical decision making, pragmatic jockeying. I don't think there's a principled break with US power as yet.
Well, the good news is we have the newsletters and dossiers from the Tricontinental Institute to help us sort through all of this. Vijay Prashad, Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks a lot.